You're listening to Radio Maria, Christian Voice in your home. We're now presenting the show, Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism, with Roy Shulman.
Hi, this is Roy Shulman, and welcome again to Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism, the show on Radio Maria that celebrates the Jewish roots of the Catholic Church, or seen the other way around, that celebrates the completion, the fulfillment, the full realization of all of the promise of Judaism in the Catholic Church and her sacraments. Well, I guess pretty much every Saturday, every time I have the show, it's a special day in one way or another on the Jewish calendar, on the Catholic calendar. But today is also, I will claim, a very special day because we are falling between two saints' feast days, both of whom have something very special to do with Judaism and very special to do with the Holocaust, and that is Saint Edith Stein, whose feast day was August 9th, and Saint Maximilian Kolbe, whose feast day is coming up August 14th. So I thought I'd dedicate the show to those two saints, and in particular to talk at some length about Saint Maximilian Kolbe, both simply recounting his story and what makes him a saint, so to speak, and also perhaps talking a little bit about what he has to do with the Jews and what he did for the Jews during his life, and also perhaps even a bit about the false calumny, false accusations that swirled around a bit at the time of his canonization about him being insufficiently sympathetic to the plight of the Jews during the Holocaust. So I will begin with a short account of St. Maximilian's life and then a longer account of his martyrdom at Auschwitz, and then talk a little bit about his teaching and about his relationship to the Jews. Before I begin, this is a live call-in show. If anyone wishes to call in at any point, the number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY, M-A-R-Y. And as a side note to the studio producer, I'll be keeping an eye on the messaging window of Skype to see when any callers might call in and to be able to take their calls. So if you would post them as they come in, I will be able to turn to them. Anyway, the story of Maximilian Kolbe. He was born January 8th, 1894. He was a high-spirited boy. He had two brothers, and although he was, of course, very, very good-hearted, he did engage in some mischief and on quite frequent occasions get into trouble, although he was always very contrite about having gotten into trouble and always very willing and almost eager to be appropriately punished for any misdeeds he did. Let me read two paragraphs about the seminal event in his childhood, which involved an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which put him not surprisingly on the right track. Let me just interrupt myself and say that I will be reading the text that I'll be reading today, come primarily from a very beautiful book called Kolbe, Saint of the Immaculata, which was edited by Brother Francis Calvelage, Franciscan of the Immaculate, and which is still available through Ignatius Press, although it was published by the Franciscans of the Immaculate. If you look or search for the book Kolbe, Saint of the Immaculata on a bookstore website or Amazon or something, I'm sure that you will be able to find it. Anyway, this event when he was a child that turned him around, let's say, that involved the Blessed Virgin Mary, I will be reading right now. So here goes. His devotion to Mary, united with a lively, independent nature, did not prevent him from getting into the usual trouble of boys his age. He could try the patience of his mother, who was something of a perfectionist in raising her children. Once she remarked in exasperation, "Raymond, what's ever going to become of you?" She then didn't give it a second thought. Raymond being, of course, St. Maximilian Kolbe's given name before he entered religion. Back to the text. Not so Raymond. After this incident, there was a noticeable change in the boy's behavior. His mother became worried at the boy's mysterious change. He was more quiet and docile and seemed more serious. Upon questioning, Raymond was reluctant at first to tell her his secret. This indomitable lady and mother was not to be easily put off in getting at the root of what she saw as a serious problem. Reminding the boy of his obligation of obedience to her as his parent, she finally succeeded. In tears, the boy told her how much her reproach had bothered him. He had sadly turned to the Blessed Mother in their home shrine and asked her the same question. Mother of God, what will become of me? He fled to their parish church and begged Mary, what will become of me? The Blessed Virgin took compassion on the miserable boy and appeared to him. With a tender, motherly expression, she held in each hand a crown, one white, the other red. She asked Raymond which one he would choose. The white signified purity, the red martyrdom. The impetuous youth, like another great saint of our time, Saint Therese of the Child Jesus, who chose all, answered, quote, I choose both. He chose well, for Mary smiled and then disappeared. The course of his life was set by no less a person than the Mother of God. He would remain chaste, the white crown, and he would be a martyr, the red crown. From that time on, he would frequently talk to his mother about martyrdom. So that's obviously the event that launched everything. I will fast forward through most of his life until his martyrdom. He joined the Franciscan order with one of his brothers as a teenager. At about 18, he was sent to Rome to study. He received a doctorate 3 years later in 1915. 4 years after that, he received a doctorate in theology. The first doctorate was in philosophy. And in 1918, he was ordained to the priesthood in Rome. He returned to Poland, of course, with the Franciscans as a Franciscan. He had a very serious bout with tuberculosis, which actually followed him for the rest of his life. He was extremely sickly, actually, despite all of the very exertion-filled activity that he was able to engage in. Anyway, he returned to Poland with the Franciscans, had a serious bout with tuberculosis, and when he came out of it for the moment, he started 2 publications, The Night and The Seraphic Flame, which together had reached a circulation of about 70,000 by 1927. The activity of his publishing outgrew the Franciscan friary where he was stationed, and he established another one, which he called City of the Immaculate, or Niepokalanów, in 1927, which grew to be a community of over 750 friars, making it the largest in Europe at the time. In 1930, he left that monastery that he had established in Poland, the Niepokalanów, to establish another City of the Immaculata in Japan, where again he started publishing The Night of the Immaculate, his newsletter, his newspaper, which reached in Japanese a circulation of 50,000 by 3 years later. He also, by the way, miraculously gained command of Japanese and was editing the newspaper in Japanese. I think it was about 6 months after he arrived in Japan. He, around the same time, also established a monastery in India, and then in 1936 he was called back to Poland, where he took control again of the Polish edition of his publications, and also began a radio station in 1938. Then the following year, in September 1939, the Nazis invaded Poland and effectively shut down Niepokalanów and arrested Kolbe. but he was released unexpectedly, one could say miraculously, certainly providentially. He was released from the Nazi prison on December 8th of that year. But then he was rearrested in February of 1941 and sent to Auschwitz. He died there at Auschwitz about 6 months later. He was beatified in 1971 and then canonized in 1982 by Saint Pope John Paul II. So with that very brief and in most ways superficial account of sort of the chronology of his life, let me read the account of his martyrdom, which is I can't say it's the center of why he's a saint, because he was a saint, and it's obvious when one reads his life. He was a saint before being martyred, and he would have been a saint, perhaps not canonized, but he certainly would have been a saint had he never been sent to Auschwitz. But his martyrdom at Auschwitz was extremely dramatic and certainly resulted directly in his beatification and canonization. I will note that for his canonization, St. John Paul II introduced a new category of martyr. And St. John Paul II defined Kolbe as a martyr of charity, a martyr of love, as opposed to a martyr of the faith. That his act of martyrdom was an act of pure love, that is, of giving up his life for another, as opposed to being an act of witnessing to the Catholic faith or to Jesus. So let me go into the account of his martyrdom. Again, if anybody wishes to call in with a question or a comment or to join the conversation, so to speak, the number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY, M-A-R-Y, or if you use Skype and are on the Internet, the Skype address is, if I'm not mistaken, Radio Maria Alexandria. Anyway, on to the account of his martyrdom. Again, reading from Kolbe, Saint of the Immaculata. A prisoner had escaped from the concentration camp of Auschwitz. This should never be allowed to happen. It was an affront to the meticulously efficient Nazi SS officers. To make sure that it would never happen again, 10 men would be condemned to die in a subterranean cell bunker by starvation and dehydration. No food or liquid until they died, an agonizing slow death which could take over 2 weeks. Added to the physical torture was the mental agony and indignity of being stripped naked and crammed into a space that would not even allow all 10 condemned men to lie down at the same time on the cold cement floor. The only furniture in the dark bunker was a bucket used to relieve one's physical needs. All the prisoners in the camp were aware of this inhuman punishment, which the SS used to discourage other prisoners from escaping. The whole prison camp was assembled on the drill field that hot summer day in July, the prisoners standing at attention for 3 hours before the brutal SS officer, Colonel Fritsch, were exhausted. At 9 in the evening, all was quiet except for the occasional barking of tracking dogs, indicating that the escapee had not yet been found. Suspense added to the unmitigated terror of the prisoners. They had plenty of time to think. Imaginations ran wild with the thought of the torturous death awaiting some of them if the prisoner was not found. When the order was given to break ranks to distribute the meager evening ration, everyone ate except Block 14, the section of the camp from which the prisoner was missing. Fritsch, the second in command of the camp, with feet planted firmly apart, savored the ultimate power he had of determining whether a man would live or die. In the deathly silence that enveloped the terrified prisoners, he barked out, "The prisoner has not been caught, but to show you how merciful the German Reich is, 20, 15, no, I have decided that only 10 men will die this time. His steely eyes showed not the least compassion. But the next time 20 men will die, since you do not keep a closer watch over the prisoner that ran away. The poor, disheartened prisoners were forced to see their evening meal dumped in a nearby canal. They were then dismissed. Tormented by hunger and sick with fear, sleep was impossible. They realized the hostages for execution would be selected from their ranks. Motivated by self-interest, everyone was for himself. Quote, "My God, let it not be me, but someone else." Close quote. Of all those standing in the ranks of Block 14, Father Maximilian Kolbe alone looked serene and composed. What was the little Franciscan priest thinking? The next day would reveal that, unlike the rest, the last person he was thinking of was himself. His calm appearance reflected his deep, prayerful peace of soul, and his trust that God, his Father, had not abandoned them. What a contrast to the vacant, haunted stares of those around him, many of whom no longer had hope. That evening the men in Block 14 slept little. Those who woke up periodically screamed in terror. Some sat on their bunks, staring vacantly into space. Others walked up and down, while Father Kolbe led those who wished to join him in prayers for courage. Still others prayed that the prisoner would be caught. The following day, after the morning roll call, all the blocks were sent to work as usual, with the exception of Block 14. They remained all day at attention, with the blistering hot rays of the sun beating down on their shaven heads. Their faces became swollen, their vision blurred, and spots danced before their eyes. Since nothing was given them to slake their thirst, they became dehydrated and weak. Many passed out. Those who fainted were clubbed and prodded with rifles, and if that failed to revive them, they were simply dragged feet first and piled at the rear of the ranks. It is amazing that Father Maximilian, sickly and frail as he was, despaired of by 20 doctors who attended him in his short life, did not collapse. No doubt he was being sustained by his heavenly Queen. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so many prisoners had fallen, weakened by the previous day's work and no meal, that the commandant, not wishing to spare prisoners from the agony of selection, ordered a break, and soup was brought from the kitchen. That evening, when the rest of the prisoners returned from their work assignments and saw the pitiful men of Block 14, all they could do for their comrades was to show them sympathy through their pitying looks. After the evening roll call, Colonel Fritsch, accompanied by Palich, the recording officer, and a group of well-armed guards, approached the men of Block 14. The deep, penetrating silence accentuated the tension which was near breaking point. The men of Block 14 were lined up in 10 rows of 60 each. After Fritsch had made his selection in the first row, Palich ordered that row 5 steps forward, march. With the passage open between the first 2 rows, the selection continued, Fritsch staring coldly and cruelly into the eyes of each man until his boots halted on the dusty square. "Open your mouth, show me your teeth, stick out your tongue." When Fritsch pointed to a man, Palich wrote down the victim's number, and he was dragged roughly out of the ranks. What the commandant's arbitrary motive for mouth examination was, no one knew. The sadistic Fritsch had a flair for the dramatic. All kinds of thoughts ran through the prisoners' minds. Their whole concentration was on avoiding the slightest movement that might draw attention to themselves. "Long live Poland," was the defiant shout of one man selected. "It is for you that I give my life. So long, friends, we'll meet again up there, and that's where real justice will be handed out to these pigs." When Fritsch pointed out one of the men, tears trickled down the prisoner's hollow cheeks as he cried out, "Oh, my wife, my poor children, I will never see them again." One of the SS men translated the Polish. Fritsch ignored the pleas of the helpless victim. Suddenly there was a commotion in the ranks. The unexpected, the unbelievable happened. A small, frail prisoner had broken ranks and stepped forward without permission. So stunned were the guards at this infringement of the usual protocol that Fritsch himself had to reach for his pistol. "What is it? Who is it?" prisoners whispered among the confusion. "It's Father Kolbe." "What? The Franciscan?" Fritsch called out, "Halt! What do you want?" Father Maximilian looked serenely into the face of Fritsch as the guards moved in. The prisoner removed his cap and said in so low a voice that only those nearby could hear him, "Please, Herr Commandant, I would like to take the place of that man." He pointed to the man picked for death and said, "I would like to die in his place." The speechless Commandant turned to Palich and demanded, "Who is this man? What is it all about?" Before the German interpreter could answer, Kolbe replied in fluent German, "I am a Catholic priest, and I want to take his place. He has a wife and family." "Are you crazy?" snapped Fritsch. "I would like to die in his place," the priest repeated. "I'm old and sick. I can barely work. I'm of no use to anyone anymore. This man is young and strong, and he has a wife and family. I have no one." Father Maximilian knew human nature well. He had to make it easier for Fritsch to accept his offer, and at the same time save face. Fritsch, in stunned amazement, continued to stare at prisoner 16670. He was totally unprepared and speechless. Here he was, a high-ranking officer in the elite SS, conversing with a prisoner. The reversal of roles, for it was Father Kolbe who was in command of the situation, unnerved Fritsch. The executioner wasn't, at that point, thinking for himself, and the suggestion of Kolbe invoked an unwritten law of the Nazi. Cripples and weaklings were not productive members of society, and thus must be liquidated. Finally, his eyes fell before the tranquil, innocent eyes of the priest, and anxious to end his embarrassment, he turned to Palich and said, "Accepted." Those who witnessed the encounter that pitted the emaciated little Polish priest in tattered prison garb and the burly, arrogant SS officer in his impeccable, well-tailored uniform will never forget that day when the inherent dignity of man, made in the image and likeness of God, was upheld over inhumanity and lack of respect for human life. Father Antonio Ricciardi, OFM Conventual, the general postulator of Father Kolbe's cause for canonization, summed up the scene well in his book Saint Maximilian, quote, "As they stood there for what seemed an eternity, the total contrast between the two was something those eyewitnesses will never forget. Basically, it was the contrast between the man who rejected God and the man who dared to love him totally. St. Francis Gajanowicz's number was stricken from the list of the condemned. At Auschwitz, a human being was nothing more than a number. Gajanowicz's husband and father covered his face with his hands and rejoined the ranks, while prisoner 16670 was added to the list and pushed to one side to join the other prisoners condemned to death. The selection finished, those remaining heaved a sigh of relief. The next order by Palich, "Take off your shoes," was the usual ritual before execution. Another order, "March," and the barefoot prisoners, clothed in just their shirts, walked slowly to the block of death. Father Maximilian was taking up the rear, helping another victim who was ready to collapse, a man for others to the very last. That evening, as the sun set in a fiery ball, witnesses agreed that they had never seen such a magnificent sunset. The priest who, as a boy, was offered the red crown of martyrdom was about to consummate his last Mass in the liturgical red of the martyrs. I will continue reading the account of the death in the starvation bunker, but before I do so, I'd like to make a couple of short comments probably on what I've read so far. One is that it was, in fact, no less than miraculous that Father Kolbe was able to make that offer and have it fulfilled, honored, so to speak. First of all, under normal circumstances, as soon as he stepped out of the ranks and took a step forward towards the commandant, he would have, so to speak, been instantly shot, or the guard's dogs set on him and him attacked by the dogs. Naturally speaking, in other words, if one is not going to accept the supernatural, one might say it was such an unexpected, unprecedented surprise that the guards and Fritsch were paralyzed and didn't respond properly from their point of view. However, I think it was actually miraculous that he was in a position, so to speak, to actually reach Fritsch and address him. Then when he did address Fritsch, the fact that Fritsch treated him with, how can I put it? I don't want to say treated him with such respect, but of course Fritsch had a lot of options open to him. Shoot him on the spot, say, fine, if you want to volunteer, make it 11 men and not 10 that die, and so forth. The fact that Fritsch actually accepted the deal as offered, I think, is also miraculous. The third point I'd like to make is this isn't historical fiction in the sense that somebody's imagination filled in the details about the atmosphere at the time and so forth, because there were a number of witnesses who survived. In other words, men of Block 14 who lived through the war, survived Auschwitz until its liberation, and were able to recount what happened, including, in fact, the Polish sergeant who Maximilian Kolbe offered himself in the place of. I apologize for not being able to pronounce his Polish last name properly, so I'll refer to him as Sergeant Francis, which is his first name. But he not only survived the war, he lived into the 1990s, I believe, and I had the opportunity to meet a Franciscan priest who took, thinking of the right words, who shepherded him around. In other words, who took him around to his speaking engagements. He basically spent a lot of the rest of his life going around to parishes, recounting what St. Maximilian Kolbe had done. And this Franciscan priest, Father James McCurry, recounted the following story to me, to us. We were a group of young men who were members of the Militia Immaculata, and he was addressing us in a retreat, and he recounted the story of when he was taking Sergeant Francis around, probably in the late 1980s or early 1990s. Sergeant Francis was quite an old and sickly man at the time, and they were on their way to a parish on Cape Cod, and Sergeant Francis was quite sick, and Father McCurry said, you know, we don't have to do this. We can turn around and you can go home. And Sergeant Francis said, no, I still have a debt to pay. So he basically lived out his life repaying the debt to St. Maximilian by recounting the story and inflaming people's love for God and reverence for St. Maximilian, and inspiring prayer to St. Maximilian, and also, of course, kindling the fires of love for their fellow men. So that is what I wanted to add. And then I'm already halfway through the hour. So I will take the opportunity now, since I've already made this into a short break, to take a break. We'll have a short musical break at this point. When we return, I will continue reading the rest of the account of the martyrdom of St. Maximilian Kolbe, and to the extent that there's time available, speaking about some of his teaching and his relationship to the Jews. You're listening to Roy Schoeman on Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria. And we are celebrating a few days in advance the feast day of Saint Maximilian Kolbe by recounting his martyrdom and, in some sense, telling stories about him. This is a live call-in radio program, and if you wish to call in, the number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY, M-A-R-Y. It's often very useful to call in during the break, or very graceful to call in during the break, because then coming out of the break, we can turn to the calls and take them first, and then return to the account of Saint Maximilian. So if you wish to call in, the number here is 866-333-6279 or 866-333-MARY, M-A-R-Y. With that, we'll be back in a few moments. Hi, this is Roy Shulman, and welcome back to Jesus the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria. And in honor of the upcoming feast day in a few days of Saint Maximilian Kolbe, I've been giving an account of his life and martyrdom, and as time permits, also going to speak a little bit about his relationship to the Jews. Before the break, we came to the point, I don't want to say the beginning of his martyrdom, but the point at which he was marched off from the normal population at Auschwitz to the starvation bunker. And now I will read the final chapter of his martyrdom, which is basically his death in the starvation bunker. So I'm reading from Kolbe, Saint of the Immaculata, edited by Brother Francis Calvelage, Franciscan of the Immaculate. The sacrificial death of Father Kolbe, who once said, "Only love is creative," made a great impression on the minds of the other prisoners, since there was so little love of neighbor in that living hell. No one would think of sharing his meager ration of bread with another prisoner, as Kolbe frequently did, let alone give up his life for a total stranger. Quote, "Greater love than this no man has than to give up his life for his friend." One of the witnesses states unequivocally that the sacrifice of Father Maximilian saved the lives of many of the inmates, for the SS officers were touched in spite of themselves and didn't mistreat or kill as many. Former prisoners of Auschwitz readily agree that from that time on, the hardships in the camp were somewhat mitigated. I will add that I have read from the accounts of others in Auschwitz that the mood in the camp was somehow changed after Father Maximilian's sacrifice, that it injected an element of, I would say, hope in the goodness of man, hope in the possibility of goodness in man, a kind of reawakening of the existence of love and goodness in the minds of the inmates, which gave them an additional will to live and will to survive. Continuing with the account. The last indignity for Kolbe and his companions was, like Christ in his passion, to be stripped naked. This humiliating crushing of the last vestige of humanity seemed to add yet another diabolical twist to their deaths. When the 10 condemned of Block 14 arrived at the dark, dank hole where they were to die, there were already 20 prisoners who lay in torment in the next cell. The thick walls could not stifle their screams, moans, and curses. As the heavy doors slammed shut on the condemned, some began to sob. One of the heartless SS jailers sneered, "You will dry up like tulips." The Nazi jailers soon realized, however, that this time things would be different, the difference between night and day. Whereas in the past howling and curses reverberated from the starvation bunkers like a scene of the damned in hell, this time the condemned prisoners did not curse and tear at each other, but sang and prayed. Soon the condemned in the other cells joined in the singing of hymns to Our Lady. What had formerly been a place of torment and bedlam became a place of divine worship. As if in choir, they answered one another from cell to cell with prayers and hymns. The main cause for this difference, this time a priest, a holy priest, was with them to share their immolation, to counsel, encourage, and administer the sacrament of reconciliation. We have seen how Kolbe, when he was asked who he was, replied, "A Catholic priest." This short identification says it all. Father Maximilian lived his priesthood and would die the Good Shepherd, ministering to the spiritual needs of his fellow victims. Few recognized that it was this, above all, that must have prompted Kolbe to make the supreme sacrifice. He could not allow these men to die without the ministering of a priest. The details surrounding his death were provided by a Polish prisoner, Bergowicz, who was assigned the grisly task of removing the bodies of those who had died during the night. He reported that even the jailers were amazed at the prayerful atmosphere and remarked, quote, "Never have we seen anything like this," close quote. Each morning when Bergowicz entered the cell to remove the corpses, he found Father Kolbe praying, either standing in the center of the death chamber or kneeling. The SS officers who watched the Polish orderly as he went about his business would bellow out orders to the condemned. During the first days, they were so absorbed in prayer that they were unaware of the SS guards' presence. When conscious of the guards, some wept and begged for a little water to relieve their maddening thirst. Father Maximilian, on the other hand, was quiet and asked for nothing. He prayed, above all, for the souls of these enemies of mankind and all that is decent and good, for they, above all, needed prayers. When he looked with compassionate eyes and serene countenance at the executioners, they could not stand his gaze, and ordered, "Turn your eyes away, do not look at us that way." As they left the cell, they would mutter to themselves, "We have never seen a man like him." Thus, hatred was conquered by love, evil by sheer goodness, and death by one who freely gave up his life so another might live, witnessing to the inherent value and dignity of each human being, but above all to that eternal destiny and life for which each person was created and redeemed. On the eve of the Assumption, August 14, 1941, there were only 4 survivors, of whom Father Kolbe was the only one conscious. The cell was needed for other victims. Seated in a corner, seeing the executioner approach with a syringe containing the poison that would kill him, with prayers on his lips, he lifted up his left arm to Killer Bach, a common criminal. Bergowicz could stand it no more and fled. When he returned, he found Father Maximilian's body propped up against the wall. His eyes were open, and he had a serene expression on his face. What was remarkable there was a certain radiance of glory, reflecting the Immaculate, from whom, no doubt, he was receiving the reward she had promised her night when she gave him the assurance of his eternal salvation. Saint Maximilian Mary Kolbe is best known as the hero of Auschwitz, who voluntarily gave up his life so that another man might live. The story of such an unheard-of heroic act has captured the imagination and admiration of all who have heard or read about it. But there is much more. How many understand that such heroism was only possible through the woman whom Kolbe loved without limits, she who has been designated the mediatrix of all graces, conceived immaculate in view of the redemptive sacrifice of her divine Son? She stood at the foot of the cross of Jesus, and she stood beside Kolbe throughout his eventful life of heroic sacrifice. This is the story of a modern-day saint who, paraphrasing the great apostle of the Gentiles, said, "I can do all things in him who strengthens me, through the Immaculate." Amen. End of the account of St. Maximilian Kolbe's martyrdom. As I mentioned several times, I've been reading from a book published by the Academy of the Immaculate, the Franciscans of the Immaculate, and distributed by Ignatius Press. The book is called Kolbe, Saint of the Immaculata, edited by Brother Francis Calvelage, Franciscan of the Immaculate. Now, I am somewhat reluctant, more than a little reluctant actually, to go from the beauty of that account and the beauty of St. Maximilian's heroic sacrifice to a short discussion of the response of the Jewish community to his canonization. Of course, I prefer spending my time on the show on sursum corda things that raise the heart to worship of God, rather than kind of dreary polemical things. But since the show is about the intersection between Judaism and the Catholic Church, I will mention that there has been opposition from the Jewish community to Kolbe's canonization and to the honor and reverence due to Kolbe, because there have been accusations that Kolbe was an anti-Semite. Now, this is, needless to say, not at all true. First I will very briefly say the basis of those accusations are basically coming from the fact that Kolbe cared about the conversion of the Jews. He cared about the evangelization of the Jews. He cared about Jews coming into full relationship with God through Jesus, through the Catholic Church, and through the sacraments. As recently as Dominus Jesus, in encyclical I don't know offhand, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, it was restated essentially that anyone who gets to heaven through Christ. There is no other way. It doesn't mean they have to know that they're a Christian. It doesn't mean that they have to be overtly Christian during their life. But if they make it to heaven, if they do achieve eternal salvation, it will be through Christ. End of story. Of course, Kolbe knew that and felt it very strongly and cared very deeply about the salvation of every human soul. He was continually praying for his persecutors. There's a very beautiful scene recounted in another book about Kolbe, A Man for Others, by Patricia Treese, where he returns to Niepokalanów, the monastery of 750 monks that he basically built from the ground up. It was destroyed by the Nazis. A friar who was next to him said something about praying for the friary, praying for the rebuilding of the friary or the protection of the friary. I don't remember exactly what it was. And Kolbe said, no, we have to pray for the salvation of the soul of he who did this. In other words, the friary, the friary is a building. There's an immortal human soul at stake, which is the Nazi who destroyed it. We have to pray for his soul. That's much more important. In a similar way, he, of course, was, fired up with a tremendous passion for praying for the souls of Jews, which meant, when possible, praying for them to come into the full relationship with God, which is available through the Catholic Church and the sacraments. So it is a misunderstanding of his love for the Jews, which results in him being accused of anti-Semitism, because he made no bones about praying for the conversion of the Jews. I will read some quotes of Kolbe that are pro-Jewish, so to speak, simply to dispel that accusation. So in 1926 he wrote, quote, "Jesus died for each one of us without distinction, and that each of us, and also each Jew, is always unworthy and is the son of our common heavenly mother." In other words, this is a response to the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus. Jesus died for every man, for every human being, for the redemption of every human being. It is every man's sin that nailed him to the cross. And every man is unworthy of redemption, and yet is the son of our common heavenly mother, and is deserves, so to speak. I don't know what the right word is, but one should yearn for their redemption through the sacrifice of Christ, every human being on an equal basis, including the Jews. He wrote to the editor of his newspaper the following: "When you speak of the Jews, I would devote great attention not to stir up accidentally or to intensify the hatred of our readers against them, who are already so ill-disposed or sometimes downright hostile in their confrontations." There was a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland at the time of World War II, and even among good Catholics, even among very pious Catholics who were readers of Kolbe's newspaper. And Kolbe is reflecting this and telling the editor, be very careful not to accidentally stir up or intensify the animosity of our readers towards the Jews. When he returned from his 2.5 months of German imprisonment, immediately following the invasion of Poland by the Germans, when he returned to Niepokalanów, he had the friary shelter all refugees who came to the door without distinguishing between Christian or Jew. And the Jewish refugees that he sheltered were estimated at being somewhere between a few hundred to over 2,000. A nearby Pole, in her own residence, gave the following testimony, quote, "When Jews came to me asking for a piece of bread, I asked Father Maximilian if I could give it to them in good conscience, and he answered me, 'Yes, you have to do this, because all men are our brothers.'" That winter, there was a Christmas party. Maximilian Kolbe, of course, organized a Christmas party at the friary for the refugees, and the Jews, of course, they weren't excluded, but they felt left out because, of course, they weren't about to celebrate at a Christmas party. So he organized a special New Year's party for them so that they wouldn't feel left out. In one of Kolbe's writings, in his newspaper, he appealed to readers to pray for, quote, "the straying children of Israel," close quote, in order to, quote, "lead them to the knowledge of the truth and the achievement of true peace and happiness, since Jesus died for everyone, and therefore for every Jew also," close quote. Finally, I will point out that the very first Mass that Kolbe celebrated in his life after he was ordained to the priesthood in Rome was celebrated at the altar in the church San Andrea della Frata in Rome, which was at the time famous because it is the spot where the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to the agnostic, anti-Catholic Jewish man Alphonse Ratisbonne, resulting in his instantaneous conversion, after which Ratisbonne and his brother ended up starting a order in the Holy Land dedicated to praying for the conversion of the Jews. The Sisters of Our Lady of Zion, I believe, is the name of the order. And so there was a very immediate, the very first act, so to speak, of Kolbe's priesthood was connected with the conversion of the Jews. So I think I'll stop there. I will say, as a very side tangential point, that whenever I lead a group to the Holy Land, which is once or twice a year, a group of pilgrims, if it's at all possible, we go to Ratisbonne's tomb in the graveyard of the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion to pray there for the intention for which he founded the order, which was the conversion of the Jews. My next pilgrimage to the Holy Land that I'll be leading is May 28th, June 7th of 2019. There are still a few spaces available, and if you're interested, just send an email to haveroytalk@gmail.com, or for more information or to contact me, you can do so through my website, salvationisfromthejews.com. Anyway, so ends our show on the martyrdom and holiness and sainthood of St. Maximilian Kolbe. I hope you have a very rich coming week, which is punctuated with the feast day for St. Maximilian Kolbe on August 14th, and of course the great feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary the following day on the 15th. Needless to say, it's hardly coincidence that Maximilian Kolbe was martyred on the vigil of perhaps the greatest feast of his patron, the Immaculata, the Blessed Virgin Mary. So I wish you a very good week. And with that, I am signing off. This is Roy Showman. The show is Jesus, the Promised Messiah of Judaism on Radio Maria. And I hope you join us again next week. Same place, same time. Bye for now.